Layne Hartsell at the Asia Institute, and I'm here with my good friend Michel Bauwens of the P2P Foundation. And actually, I was at the P2P Foundation last decade as a researcher in philosophy of technology. And today, like some of our personal conversations, Michel, I had invited you to talk with me publicly about this historical trajectory of civilization and how some of your work can provide some guidance to people today, as I'm pretty sure, and most of us, things are coming apart. How can we, build some structures that'll be there?
Right.
So I'm gonna start off with this kind of an excavation of civilization, and then I'll pose the question to you and let you go from there. If you want to go with the Catholic Church saving Western civilization, if you want to go that far, or even back, if you want to go back to Europe, I mean, 5,000 years ago, we can do that too. So basically, the historical record and trajectory of civilization was defined in the modern era. So it was in the 18th century where we came up with this idea of, or this term civilization, which is a set of ideas and practices that culminate in what we call urbanization. So urbanization is it's a large influx of resources to the city center. Anybody reads the myth of Gilgamesh about 5,000 years ago, what does Gilgamesh do? He and Enkidu, they go to the Levant, they cut down the cedar forest. The cedar forest in the Levant area, there in northern Mesopotamia and down, were so thick that the sun never touched the ground. That's how thick the cedars were, and that went on up for a while until they started building the Phoenician fleets and the Carthage fleets and so forth. So the ideology is cut down the trees, take them back to urban centers. That goes right on up till today. So Harry Merlo of Louisiana Pacific Timber Company, he said, cut down all the trees, take it all. So Francis Bacon, and positively he thought, called this the imperium of man. He wanted this kind of thing, but of course, if we take, like, say, eco-philosophy, we take Derek Jensen or Kirkpatrick Saley or Gary Snyder, your work, there's a problem with this ideology. So there's an ideology with civilization along with this practice of massive influx of resources. So right on up until about the medieval cities, I mean, maybe if we had stopped there with, say, Dante, Florence, and at that time they were out in the mountains hiking around, they were getting outside the city, whereas, say, when Tertullian was around, people felt comfortable in this kind of little microcosm of the city because there's at those times there were lots of animals around too. So you couldn't hardly sail a ship because there were so many fish. On land, there were so many bears that you'd see one every 15 minutes in certain areas, this kind of thing. So, I mean, people certainly needed to have some kind of feeling of security. So if you look at Tertullian, that was that. But you get to, say, Dante in the medieval times, you would see they started to get out and about. The argument there, I think, is that if we had stopped at the medieval city, maybe we would not have gone into, say, this catastrophic extraction, what we call overshoot today. So then comes capitalism in around 1800. By 1850, it was middle 19th century, it was going pretty strongly, enough for the scientists, even at that time, to say, hey, look, they were hypothesizing this is going to affect the geophysical system directly. Okay, and that goes right on up until today. So by 1950, most people started to go into cities, and today we have what we call megapolis, but I call it the megapolitron, which means the fast acceleration from 1950 into the, say 58% of people today live in cities. that's the excavation that I want to start with, and I want to go with your some of your ideas around, the framework that I've just given. Of course, we can go outside the framework too. I mean, if you have another definition of the city. So let me
Well,
start.
yeah, I mean, I largely agree with, um, your scheme. Um, so I think, if we think about what civilization is, um, I think, and it's probably what you think as well. It's a system to master nature. And according to, so I've been reading a lot of macro historians like Spengler, Toynbee, Quigley, Sorokin, and a lot of them agree that, um, there was some kind of crisis, and it might have been a climate crisis. There was like, deglacialization, and at some point there was like a swampification of Mesopotamia and a drying up of North Africa. That's, for example, what Toynbee explains, right? Um, so why is this important? Because if you look at the very early civilizations like Harappa, Minoa, and maybe some others that I don't know, what you see is, fairly advanced agricultural civilizations
Mm-hmm.
with palaces, but no walls,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right? So, and that means two things. One is that they were not afraid of neighbors, but also they were not afraid of their own citizens, right? That is quite an important thing, because in each of these other cases they would have need some kind of defense mechanism, right? And for example, there's an author I like a lot called Kojin Karatani, who writes a book called Isonomia about Ionia, and he basically describes a very similar situation where people were moving quite freely amongst these cities. Um, but so this is an assumption, it's like an origin story, right? But so we have to assume at some point there was a climate crisis that pastoral nomads could not survive because of the drying up of their lands. And, and then you have these juicy, basically proto civilizations there. And that starts basically a dynamic that civilization couldn't stop, which is a dynamic between civilization and pastoral barbarians. And each time a civilization would weaken, some outside barbarian tribe would come in and take over the civilization, and the process would start over again. And there's an increasing number of books who tie this process to climate change. For example, Rome and the Hans in China collapsed at the same time. So
Mm-hmm.
the assumption is that in the steppe there was a drought, which has the effect of weakening the civilization because things grow less, and then the hungry nomads, you can't survive either, and that creates. And so from then on, you have really militarized, slave-based civilizations that are in competition with each other, right? And that's a fact of life. So I personally believe in multi-level selection theory, which basically says the following. So for humanity, because we are cultural beings, like we grow out of the purely biological evolution and we become cultural and we start evolving culturally. And that means evolving in groups. So that a weak member of a strong group, has more chance to survive than a strong person in a weak group, right? And so that puts tribes, empires, kingdoms in competition with each other. But the first phase of civilization, in my view, is still regional or continental, right? Basically, I think the Mongols were the first to try like a really transcontinental, empire, but they failed to do it. But that was like the first really attempt. Before that, there's China, there's Rome, there's Mesopotamia, there's Egypt, um, and so you have an extractive dynamic inherent in civilization, but that was only playing out at the local level. So it's not that the previous civilizational forms before capitalism were not extractive. They were, and they did destroy their own, uh, their own domains, basically, overusing their own local resources, right? But what happened is that civilization would like move around. So, when, for example, the Western Roman Empire dissolves, that's not the end of civilization because the Roman Empire, under Byzantium lasts for another 1,000 years, right? And so there's a thesis, which I think is correct. It's called Central Civilization by David Wilkinson, who says civilization never disappeared. So, in other words, these networks of cities, with their urban hinterlands, and so civilization basically as a relation between agriculture and cities, division of labor, class-based societies, and armies separate from the people, right? That's kind of like the civilizational nexus, right? That has been actually problematic from the start. But we can't be moral about it because the thing is that's what the reality was. And if you were not engaged in that competition, you would lose and you would become subjected or slaves to a stronger empire. It's basically only in the peripheries, like in the mountains and the swamps, that more egalitarian tribal modalities basically could sustain themselves for fairly long times, but not in the core agricultural areas, right? And so what changes under capitalism is basically the planetarization of that process, right? So it's still the same extractive nature, but supercharged and global because there's new energy, there's new methods of exploitation, et cetera, et cetera. And so you could see basically that, you could see, and that's why I do believe in some form of evolution where, and that doesn't mean it gets better all the time, but it just means that despite all the chaos and the transitions and the bifurcations and the crisis, there is some type of linearity, for example, in the size of cities, in the level of technical knowledge, in the available technology that is over time growing. So what you have to see is like there is some linearity, there are cycles. So that creates a spiral dynamic, if you like, right? Where civilizations come and go up and down, but they never go down lower than the previous cycle. And then in between these cycles, you have chaotic transitions that are best seen as bifurcation. So it's not about evolution, about things getting better all the time. As we thought in 9th century, it's about particular forms of civilization that work for a time, solve a number of solutions, solve a number of problems that they have. But precisely because they solve that problem and then are successful, they create a new level of problems they can't solve on their own, right? And so very broadly, you could say, matter, energy, information. So you have matter energy relations that are bound by knowledge, and that's where the media come in, right? The particular ways where you can bind matter and energy at a certain level of exploitation. And obviously hunter gatherers use a lot of matter and energy than craft agrarian, and craft agrarian use a lot less energy than industrial. So that's kind of, I think, the broad view of civilization. And then the problem with contemporary civilization is, of course, that we reached a level of overshoot that is now global. So there's nowhere where another civilization cannot grow out of this if we don't solve the fundamental problem of that balance, right? And so a nice way to put it, I think, and it's not mine, but I can't remember why I read this, is so we have a immature biosphere, was very unstable, and then we have a great oxygenation event, and that turns out to create a balanced, biosphere like Gaia. I think it's called Earth Systems now. And basically, it seems to be that the biology of the planet, somehow works to keep everything in balance as much as it can. So,
Right, right.
if you do something,
So
yes,
those oxygen producing bacteria, man, they really changed the environment.
yeah, exactly.
The
And they
oxygen is
were, they
toxic,
were
right?
poisonous at the beginning, right? They actually destroyed what was there before, but then eventually created a new complex and dynamic system. So then out of that comes humanity. So we create, let's say, a technosphere, and we are still in the phase of an immature technosphere. In other words, a technosphere that is not able to live within the equilibrium of the biosphere. And I think so, very broadly speaking, this is the big challenge we, as humanity is going through. And, whether we will succeed or not, that is another question. But that is like, I think, like the broad picture. And if I may bring one more thing in.
Mhm.
So I think in terms of coordination engines, right? So basically you have a productive class, farmers, workers, knowledge workers today, whatever, they are. And then you have a managerial class that is in charge of the coordination, right? And it's linked to a particular form of technology.
Right.
So when we invent the alphabet, writing and then the alphabet, we create a writing class, a writing elite. And, in the beginning, maybe only 2% of the population could read and write. And that creates civilization, right? Then we create printing, and that creates capitalism in a sense, or it enables, I wouldn't say it creates it, but it enables capitalism, right? And now we have, this thing called the internet, digital networks, and that enables something new, right? And so
Right.
until 5,000 years ago, more or less, we were, tribal, kinship based, and gifting and commoning were the main value systems. So gifting meaning, I keep the peace with neighboring villages and clans and families by gifting something, and they feel compelled to give something back. And in a paradoxical way, we start competing through gifting. And then commoning is basically, organizing yourself as a community to do things together because that benefits the whole community. So gifting and commoning were the mainstay until 5,000 years ago. Yes.
In the U.S., we have a tradition of giving fruitcake. When I was a kid, we of giving fruitcake at Christmas, and the joke was that is this the fruitcake that you gave me last Christmas? And this fruitcake
Yeah.
would always just keep moving
Right.
around, which is
Well, that's actually what happened in many Polynesian islands. They had these circuits of
right,
the
right,
gifts. And these objects actually had a history. They remembered like where it came from, who had used it, and things like that, right? Anyway,
right,
so I think that so that was replaced by the market state civilizational nexus, right? And so here's my belief that in order to pass through this needle of like a mature technosphere, that civilizational model is no longer functioning. So in other words, the paradigm of pure mastery of humanity over nature, which is like the civilizational paradigm, and then the industrial paradigm that came on top of it, which is everything is just mechanics and objects that are resources for humanity only. That story and practice is now counterproductive.
right.
And so we're groping for something else. And so, this is like at least a 5,000 year shift, right?
Right.
And so what I believe is not necessarily that we totally abandon markets and states, that we will create meta infrastructures that can bind them to higher levels of equilibrium. And
Right.
here is where the commons comes in. So based on my study, I believe that the commons are a periodic counter-cyclical regenerative institution and practice. So in other words, when markets and states go up in the up cycles of civilization and societies, the commons weaken, sometimes almost disappear, like today under capitalism. But when markets and states reach their peak and start declining because of overshoot and overuse and all of that, then the commons institutions come back. And the best example of this are dark ages, where there are no markets and states, and then the commons-based institutions like monasteries and who don't have an extractive ruling class, but they're institutions that self-reproduce with collective property, and so can reinvest everything in their own system expansion.
Mhm.
um, those are regenerative periods. And so if you look at European history, and I'm sorry that I don't know the other history that well, but you could say like 500 to 1000 is a dark age, right? That creates the conditions for the Middle Ages, the High Middle Ages, 11th to 14th century, right? And there's some studies that are remarkable. Like they find that the skeletons in the Dark Ages are taller than
Right.
later.
More healthy.
And why could that be? Because these people live in villages with their families. The church imposes some kind of morality on the warrior class. Um, and, so and they have all these religious holidays, and they have, the Sunday, and they have Blue Monday, the day of the family. And they don't pay taxes. So, they only have to sustain their warriors, and it takes about 100 farmers to maintain one night, right? And so, I don't want to idealize this, but these are in a way interesting situations where you see the commons institutions, so the mutualized institutions, thriving and regenerating the nature and the local environments, which then paradoxically creates the conditions for civilizations to come back, right?
Mm-hmm.
And dark ages are also important because they create the conditions for paradigm change. Like, so if you're familiar with people like Gebser, Jean Gebser, and that kind of thinking, where and I agree with this, that again we have bifurcations of levels of consciousness. The capacity of dealing with levels of complexity is not the same. But this is, again, we should be careful. This is not just like plain evolution where things get better and better. These are bifurcations, right? So for example, the Roman slave system, the work is done by slaves, and the ideal of the ruling classes is not to work at all, but to work on their virtues and philosophy, and to be um, by the time of the end of it, you know it creates a reaction against it, and those are the Christians who are ascetic, but also for labor, right? They think labor is positive because they actually originally a proletarian movement, and they were the ones doing the work, right? And now they're in charge through their church in a way, and they impose, ora et labora, pray and work is now the new paradigm in the Middle Ages. So it's not just like an evolution, it's also a bifurcation, a reaction against the Roman system into something that is completely different, right? So when we say that, society gets more complex, it's not a simple story of progress. It's a complicated story of, upsize, downsize, crisis, bifurcations, chaos. It's a complex story. But I still think that. So this is the big question, and maybe I'll stop and let you intervene. So the big question is: so look at the end of the Roman Empire. It truly collapsed because they couldn't maintain their complexity. They, could no longer conquer, so they couldn't pay their soldiers, so they had to overtax their farmers, etc., right? And so when it fell, there were no more roads, no more cities. So that was like a real leveling down to a lower level of complexity originally. But then look at the feudal crisis, which pits the Catholics against the Reformation, right? That's the way it expresses itself.
Mhm.
What comes out of it is actually more complex. I mean, we can critique capitalism, but it basically what it did was it put the religion on the side as a private affair and replaced it with capital state nation, like this kind of triune,
Mhm.
system that is still there today, right? That was more complex because they had a technology to deal with it, which is print, which the Romans didn't have.
Mhm.
And in a way, and this is maybe I'm too optimistic, but I think that the internet, at least theoretically gives us a chance not just to go down, but to eventually, go to a higher level of complexity. And so that's why I talk about cosmolocalism. So not just localization and kind of a regression to the local, but a combination of relocalization and keeping all the advantages of the digital technologies to learn fast, to share innovations, and to cooperate at the and so what we need to do, in my view, is combine differentialism and universalism, right? So in other words, the local of cosmolocal is, can we create societies where regions can defend themselves, like bioregionally oriented, defend their environment, defend non-human beings, defend the resources, along with virtual, digitally organized communities that also have their differential, sovereignty and capacity to maintain their difference, but coupled with a universalism that is the care for the planet, right? And so that's where the digital commons comes in. The digital commons comes in as a vehicle to organize that planetary care. So I'll stop here, but that's kind of broadly, my vision or whatever, or my analysis, whatever you want to call it.
Okay, let's yeah, I got you here. I want to do one. I want to go back at you on one point and then move on to bioregionalism. I I agree with this kind of trajectory that you were talking about. So you have let's go back to early Europe there, which at the time 2,000 to 3,000 years before Athens was larger than Athens. So the argument there is that and they had cooperatives with the irrigation and this kind of thing. It had to have been because there's no walls, there's no necropolis, there's no palaces. It's all and then of course now we know, going even farther back to Göbekli Tepe and Ukraine and this kind of stuff. They didn't have that either, but they didn't have the big temples and the necropolis. So there must have been some kind. I mean, the interpretation is there must have been some kind of more egalitarian system there, because when you look at, say, Egypt or later Europe after the tribes come down off the steppes and then take over, and Uruk and Ur start going to war, and then out of that comes, you go into Assyria and all these really vicious kind of city states and taking over and that kind of thing. Okay, if that is the actual history, and I think that's a fairly good approximation. I mean, it matches what we see in the archaeological record. There is one point there that is a moral question, an ethical question. Is it's not just say a Marxian or Marxist material dialectic where you just have material going back and forth. Okay, well, our civilization conquered yours. We're sorry, but you guys were in the way. But we had to do it because we had to get those resources back into our cities. So we create a bigger hinterland. Once we create a bigger hinterland, then we have another, city state. So we start getting this network, and then eventually we get the hinterland becomes the earth, and then we have this kind of Westphalian system that you were talking about. I think that there's a problem with this. One is, I mentioned the ideology earlier, that this can't happen without people being convinced of the ideology. So if we take, and we're going to head towards bioregionalism, but what I'm getting at here is the indigenous model, where we talk about democratic confederation. It looked more like bioregionalism at the time. There were some groups like the Aztecs, for example. They tear everything up. Going to fight everybody. They very well could have taken over North America had they gone in that trajectory before the British come and so forth and so on. But at the same time, there was a group right next door to them that they were at war with in Tlaxcala, highly democratically organized. The Aztecs couldn't take them over. They were, and it would have looked more like an Iroquois confederacy. So my argument here is that one is that it's possible to have large numbers of people in a location without destroying the planet, and also without having to impose an authoritarian structure. Okay, that's one part. The other part is that I argue that we don't conflate culture with civilization. Civilization is a specific kind of culture, what we call urban culture, right? And and culture is something that where you have human beings coming together, you get a society out of it. We understand the rules and roles that we have, Jung and this kind of stuff. We have recipe, we have science, and so forth. Okay, it just so happens that in civilization, it's able to grab a hold of so many resources, and you get this kind of feeding up into this kind of exponential trajectory, and then bam, it collapses. Is that kind of in the same ballpark of what you're?
Yeah. So I think the challenge today is, because we're planetary, right? So
Yes.
that's the challenge today, is that, the let's say the dark side of civilization, which is this competition and the need to be hegemonic, and it's there. I mean, that's what you see is that, China and the US are competing, and there's war in Gaza, and there's war there, here and there. So we can see that is playing out. And so that's the problem with that, what I call the extractive institutions. The markets and states are inherently in a competitive dynamic.
Mhm.
So at a local level, what I think societies did was to create internal equilibrium. So, for example, you always have the warriors and the priests, right? And so the so-called axial religions, Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism, Hinduism, Christianity, the Hebrew prophets, and all, and the Greek philosophers. These were all like attempts to ethicize and pacify the worst part of civilization. So the way I see it is, you have like a coordination engine that is extractive, that is competitive, and when it initially deploys itself, it's very cruel. It's and then over time there's a reaction, right? And that reaction is often like commons oriented.
Mhm.
Uh, and there's an author that has an interesting view on this, Kojin Karatani. And his book is called The Structure of World History. So he says, okay, mode A, gifting and commoning. Mode B, the state. Mode C, the market. But he says there's always mode D. And what is mode D? This is the attempt of the people to recreate mode A at a higher level. And so he says initially that's always what these religions try to do. They're proletarian movements
Mhm.
protesting, against upper class exaggerations and extraction, and eventually, having a relative success in the sense that they become part of the new civilization that comes afterwards, and that is, so, and I mean, if you look, for example, the difference between Rome and the medieval West, you have to recognize that Rome was much more cruel.
Well,
They
I wanted
had
to say
they
this,
had
Michel.
human sacrifice, they had slavery,
Yeah,
all things that
let me jump in.
disappeared, right? Under yes, yes,
Let me jump in because this is a problem today. Is that yes, the patriarchy is awful. I mean, utterly awful, right? I mean, the Catholic Church and all this kind of stuff. But
well, I don't
people,
agree with that, but that's
well,
another discussion.
well, I mean,
Yeah.
there's, the Vatican II, 1962, and all this kind of stuff. I agree with you in this aspect. Combining, say, Anton Pentecost or Veblen with the Catholic Church. Okay, it's a good idea. But what I'm saying is, what I wanted to get at is that the patriarchy is not the worst. A Roman or an Assyrian or a Nazi vicious militarism would make women utterly, like they would be turned into money. I mean, they would be totally commodified. So when we critique the patriarchy, we shouldn't. The idea is not just to take down males. I mean, the males are uh, they were cannon fodder in the Roman times. If you were just a regular person, same as in Athens, the idea here is not to take down males, but to to do exactly what Christianity did to the Roman Empire. Yeah, it got taken up into the Roman Empire, and the cross gets put on the sword, the shields of Constantine and so forth. However, it blunted that aggression, that vicious aggression, into something that was at least livable. So by the time you get to the medieval city, it wasn't a bad life. I mean, I don't want to. I don't want to get. I'm good. I don't want a lot of feminists to attack me here because I'm making it look good. What I'm saying is, we don't want Assyria or Rome or Berlin.
Right.
You know. You know what I'm getting
Well,
at?
I personally
There's
think
something to be
I
said for
personally
the
think medieval cities were, a fairly high point of civilization because you
right,
had 98% of the people living in the cities. They were free citizens
right,
organized in guilds, and 98% were in associations. There were only 2% of the people that were indigent, not protected, right? And then they had systems like just price theory, where the price of wheat and basic goods was regulated so that everybody had food, right?
yes,
So and every guild was self-organized, had its own judicial system. So these are by no means like the worst of the worst. These were pretty good arrangements, um, and very
the Magna,
distributed, contract based. And
Magna
again, sure, we don't have to idealize it, but it's so, because as long as you're in a competitive environment, right? So you need a strong warrior class, and they need to defeat the enemies. But then if they behave in the same way when they come home, then you don't have a society, right? And that's so the role of the religions is basically to pacify the warrior class, and to create a balance. And if you look at the ideology of that time, there are organic ideologies, right? Every class has a place, and the society is a human body, and we need the hands and the legs, the workers, and we need the head, and we need the heart, and so they had this vision of complementarity. And I'm not saying they achieved utopia, certainly not, but it was regulated to keep equilibrium, right? And then capitalism destroys that equilibrium.
right.
But then we have the labor movement and the women's movement and all of these. They're the contemporary attempts, to recommunify, as it were, that type of civilization. And you have to admit, for a while, it worked pretty well. I think the difference is that it's in order to pacify the Western working classes, they had to intensify the exploitation of nature and the global South,
Right.
to such a level that that's it's not sustainable. And so where the commons comes in is that I believe mutualization is a key factor to retain complexity at a much lower thermodynamic cost, right? So, for example, this is from a German city, I forgot the name. So they replaced the commercial transportation system with cargo bikes and e-vans, electric vans, right? Same level of commercial transport and only 5% of the energy previously used, right? So that's mutualization. That's organizing it collectively, putting the competition, regulate the competition. And so this is what I imagine as this is the solution I propose, is to systematically mutualize the provisioning systems in the cities and bioregions, right?
Right.
To achieve dramatic gains in matter energy expenditure, um, and come to collective agreements on a global scale where we can regulate resource use and non-human beings. Basically, so capitalism is a machine that has created, through double entry book accounting, like narcissistic accounting, right? You only see whether you are doing well. Are your profits up? Is your capital up? And what we can't see in a capitalist system is the ecosystemic effects, the positive and negative social and ecological externalities. We are blind to it. And then we create a state the welfare state and ecological regulations to keep that in balance. And I guess what I'm suggesting is that we need something at a global level now that is commons based to bind, market and state institutions within this higher equilibrium. And so the reason I'm interested in, things like Web3 and crypto is because they actually, are creating a global coordination engine, which, so it's a universal ledger, it's a planetary ledger. It can include what they call ecological state, so the state of the ecology. You can formalize the state of the ecology, and every entity can know what is improving or degrading its planetary ledger, right? And then we can invent new techniques where that the voice of non-human entities that we need, like the worms that make the soil fertile and the bees, and but basically everything is interconnected. So we need to, and so that's where I think the civilizational model is, largely obsolete, or has to be, transcended and included in a higher level integration, right? Where they don't necessarily have to disappear completely. Because, here's my argument, right? Markets are not just evil. You look at history, for example, Ionian, and Caradani calls it isonomia. And well, they were all traders and they had an egalitarian system. Same for the medieval cities, and also the monastics had were producing surpluses, and the state, as long as we have territory, we need some kind of arrangement to manage the rules within a certain geographic entity, right? It doesn't have to be the nation state, but it certainly is going to be something. So my argument is that we don't need to abolish all of this, but we need to integrate it at a higher level. And so, for example, the way I think about DAOs is as, fourth sector organizations which allow market, public authorities, voluntary NGO type, and permissionless contributions in peer-to-peer systems, right? And all of that is integrated at a higher level. I'm not saying it's that we have what we need right now, but basically what I want to achieve is combining this new technical capacity with what people are doing at the local level. So the revolution in urban commons, citizens taking over their provisioning system at the local level, and this is happening at an exponential scale. Maybe 2-3% of the population is doing this in the cities. Not enough, but it's growing. But then giving them scale, right? Giving the local a cosmolocal scale by using knowledge commons and cooperation protocols that are translocal, right? Because we cannot just be local when we have a planetary crisis. We also need planetary level corporations that can deal with meta systemic issues, like a nuclear. Even if you close down a nuclear plant, you have 40,000 years, 100,000 years of nuclear waste. So we can't just say, let's go back to farming. We need to, maintain a level of complexity. And so, anyway, so yeah, that's kind of like the very broad way how I see it. And, so I talk something about post-civilization, and sometimes, fourth type civilization. That's, I'm not out of that yet, how to best see that.
Yeah. For people that are
because
listening,
I think that we shouldn't idealize pre-civilization, right? Pre-civilization, yes, clans and tribes and kinship, but also generalized human sacrifice, permanent war. And, there's now mass, like they call meta studies, right, about the number of people who die. And I know this may sound counterintuitive, but relative to the population, a lot less people die in civilization than before. Like, the level of conflict is actually very high because there's no integration, right? Yes, you can have the Iroquois Federation.
There's a lot going on
but,
here.
but they were fighting with others and making slaves. You know what
Okay,
I mean? So
yeah.
empire, for example, extends the territory where there is peace internally and shifts the violence and within the empire there's law, right?
Mhm.
And then in the higher religions there is no more human sacrifice. And then in Christianity there is, until the 18th century, the US, but there was no slavery. Europe was a continent without slavery, or like very, very minimal, just a bit of domestic slavery. It was not a slave-based system.
Okay, I disagree with you on this point, but leading up to this, I'm in total agreement. And I wanted to tell people that are listening in, as we started to get into this is what normally Michel and I do in private. So we're just basically doing our research in public here. The first thing is I want to tie up patriarchy. I've got a rainstorm coming in here, so I hope that it doesn't affect too much. Let me tie up patriarchy. What I was getting at there is that, and you already know this, but I'll say this for others, is that yes, patriarchy is awful, but it had a blunting effect on a very vicious system. Uh, and I would certainly want to have a liberal democracy than I would Catholic Church-run system, or or an Assyrian or Roman or Egyptian or any stuff. I'm just trying to say that we got the Charter of the Forest, we got the Magna Carta within a patriarchy system, and you know a lot more about the Charter of the Forest. We don't have a lot of time for that. The other thing is I wanted to say that.
By the way, I actually have another 5 minutes.
Okay.
I have something at 8:30.
Let me, I'll tie up the thread here and then let you finish with the final comment, okay? When Michel was talking about the DAO, what he's talking about is a decentralized autonomous organization, which are these structures that are built on top of the Ethereum network. The Ethereum is a protocol on the internet that's known as cryptocurrencies, but it's a protocol on which you can build organizations on, that you can have independent voting coming in, and then you can organize production off of that system. So what Michel's talking about there is a DAO. And when he's talking about metalocal production, he and Vasilis Kostanakis wrote articles about, and I'll post these online if you want, about cosmolocal production. So what you have is this kind of overarching digital structure that has code, knowledge, and design that can be shared anywhere for almost nothing. And then the heavy local production, like the heavy things, can be made at the local level so that you don't have to transport logistics all over the world. So I'm trying to give some background, because sometimes Michel and I will go very quickly through these things and people are trying to catch up. Michel, I disagree with you on the violence aspect, because civilization just killed 40,000 Palestinians in 8 months, dropped more bombs than in World War II, blah blah blah. At Europe, the numbers that died, say compared to Hiroshima in just a few seconds, were and per capita was far different. The same thing, say in Tuxcala or with the Iroquois. There was internecine warfare between, Indians. I mean, they're human beings, right? What I'm talking about, I think, is it's possible to have structures of large numbers of people that are democratically organized, but you have to have a fluid structure in there. David Graeber and, David Wingro talk about all this stuff, so we can't really go there. But I want to give you the last comment here to tie up what you see going on. Can we move, in your opinion, towards a bioregional democratic confederation with, say, like, let me throw out there, say, like sovereign funds, like Norwegian Sovereign Fund, or something like this that can protect the natural resources and limit their use, say, within an ecotechnics rather than an authoritarian techniques?
Yes. I mean, I have friends that are working on this, right? So there's this project called Tools of the Commons, for example, it's just one of them. And so what he's doing, or they are doing, is let's put together a number of regenerative projects in a particular bioregion. Then you create this layer on top of it, like a DAO layer on top of this, right? And you declare digital sovereignty, right? And then you apply the financial techniques that nation states are using to attract capital, right? Because like the nation states, 80% of their income comes from bonds, not from taxes, right? So there's attempts like this, or the region network where they have their planetary ledger, like 36 different metrics, to determine the environmental environment, and then they look at all the possible income streams that exist, and then they try to create a connection between, let's say, doing biochar and accessing the. So there's various, but but basically, I believe in chaotic transitions, right? So I don't think these things are necessarily smooth. I think that what might happen is that the competition within markets and states can get so bad that some of the people in the elite start saying, well, this is not the way forward anymore, right? And then we probably we need different kinds of structure to survive, right? And it's only in that kind of situation that you can imagine like a nonlinear change. So the only thing we can do now is what I call seed forms, prefigurative seed forms, to launch this process of to create projects outside of the logic of capital, and to protect, to get property, to get collective properties, to protect those collective properties, to create income, like a coalition of organic farmers owning their land, village co-ops owning energy, and gradually create social strength, which we don't have. So I use as the example the end of the Roman Empire, where you have the Christian communities, and at some point, I think in the third century of the plague, right?
Right.
And what the emperor is seeing is that the Christian communities deal much better with the plague than the pagan communities because they have solidarity, and the pagan communities don't have solidarity. And so that's why they gradually start favoring, the Christian institutions, because they actually, are also in their own interest. And then you get this kind of convergence between, the management of the church and the management of the empire, right? So then when the Germanic overlords take over, and they basically, interdict that the Roman elite can have weapons. So what you have then is you have a military structure that's managed by the Germanic conquerors, and you have an administrative elite, which is done by the Romans, but mostly through the church, because there was like a convergence between the church and the administrative structures of the empire, right? And so what happens is that rich Romans then suddenly start massively financing the church because it's the only way for them to keep their place in that society. So, their sons and daughters can be the abbots. And if you're like a rich senator, you can retire in a monastery, and you have a library, you can speak Latin,
Like,
you have access to your
like
own
at Venice.
culture.
At Venice, the Doge, when the Doge
Yeah.
would relinquish, they would go to the monastery, right? In
Exactly.
Venice.
And so that's how I see Web3. I know it's paradoxical, but what I see is that a lot of people in the elite realize that the game is up, and so here you have to believe me, but this is what I actually believe. Web3 is a community of faith. It's a political, ethical movement which believes in decentralization, which wants to create new structures that are as independent as they can from big banks and big states. That's their belief system, right? and they're being funded by this capital, which is trying to find a way out of the capitalist crisis, right? So it's an exit strategy between both greedy and idealistic people, like you would probably have found in the church as well. Um, and so at some point, I think this will be, and so the problem today, and I have to stop here, is that of course this won't work as long as it's not connected to actual physical production. So that's what
Right.
I'm arguing with my Web3 friends is you have to connect with the commons communities that produce organic food, shared transportation, collective housing. And so you would have like a bioregional structure, right? And then you have a guild of traveling cryptos, which teach people how to use the cosmic level, right?
The digital
So
nomads,
that's
right?
what, yeah,
Yeah.
they're nomadic because they can work in different places, right? And so I say instead of being nowheres, like rootless, you should be everywheres and rootful and connect to the material commons movement, and then we will get somewhere. Right now, we're just like preparing two different things that need to be connected but are not yet connected.
That's really great. Michel, thanks so much for your time. I'm Layne Hartsell with the Asia Institute with Asanat Kumpan, who is an aesthetics philosopher who organized this for us, and Mary Brennan of Forus, which is a crypto bank in South Africa.
All right.
All right. Good night,
Well,
everybody.
thank you, Vanessa. Thank you, Mary. Thank you. I see Marco, Gio. So I know some of these people. So thanks for listening in.
Thank you so
Okay.
much. Bye
Yeah.
bye.
Thank
Thank you
you.
so much. Much appreciated. Take care.
All right.